last time I outlined several 10 each approaches to fascism that I consider to be mere explanations that do not actually lead to any kind of understanding of it, and 10 approaches that I consider to be fruitful toward developing a concept of fascism, and thereby, of course, also, which is the necessary part, may lead to strategies to combat it. And like I said last week, this is not a question where academics, universities, and other institutions of civil society have any kind of right to be neutral, in that the free inquiry that we conduct in these institutions absolutely depends on freedom of speech, on a pluralistic society, on democratic norms and governance, and all those kinds of things. In other words, authoritarian science that is dictated by the church, the state, or the ruling class is bad science. To the extent that science sometimes can't help but tell uncomfortable truths to power, it will often, more often than not, run up against powerful interests in society, who want nothing more than to not talk about things that matter and or might challenge their dominance. So whether it is corporate-funded foundations pouring money into research to disprove climate science, whether it is about building up whole universities that provide an amenable space for discredited theories about race, gender, and so forth, or whether it is simply a fascist power grab, like in the Florida university system, where the most liberal campus of the Florida State University system had 6 members installed on their board, 2 of which were well-established fascist ideologues who proceeded immediately to remove the university president, a Black woman, and begin a purge of all content that spoke to ethnic, gender, women's studies, critical theory of any shade, but especially critical race theory, and so forth. So that is the opposite of academic freedom. That is the opposite of what the university should do. And if we are doing our job, and we think that we're doing our job by being neutral, teaching the controversy and showing all sides, we are not, in fact, doing our job. So part of the story of the rise of fascism in this country is the story of the utter abject failure of that middle stratum of the liberal professional class, of the institutions that nourishes and sustains it, university first and foremost. So, so far for my explanation, not apology, for taking a clear position here that in fact fascism is bad, and not just because it is somehow amorphously a bad thing, one shouldn't do it and so forth, but because it stands for specific things that you can name and identify. So one of the things that are inherently part of the deal, if you will, of fascism is imperialism. Imperialism as in going out by military means, sometimes also by commercial means, to subjugate other peoples, countries, their populations, their economies, their resources, to destroy whatever competing industries they have, develop markets for one's own industries, possibly use them as mere raw material suppliers for one's own industrial economy. So, in the words of Georgy Dimitrov, who was the leader of the Communist International and a lawyer from Bulgaria, who was also chair of the Communist Party of Bulgaria, as well as the lawyer who defended the Dutch anarchist who had set fire to the Reichstag and who the Nazis tried to pin this on in order to prove that their power grab was legitimate, that there really was a communist conspiracy against the German state. Dimitrov traveled to Germany to defend this man, to accuse fascism of, basically all the atrocities it had committed. And in 1935, at the convention of the Communist International, he gave a programmatic speech in which he characterized fascism in power as the open, terrorist dictatorship of the most reactionary, most chauvinistic, and most imperialist elements of financial capital, of finance capital. In this text that I've also assigned to you, he argues that with the development of the very deep economic crisis, you are aware that in 1929, there was the beginnings of an extended and deep economic crisis of capitalism, with the general crisis of capitalism becoming sharply accentuated and the mass of working people becoming revolutionized, fascism has embarked upon a wide offensive. The ruling bourgeoisie more and more seeks salvation in fascism with the object of taking exceptional predatory measures against working people, preparing for an imperialist war of plunder, attacking the Soviet Union, enslaving and partitioning China, and by all these means, preventing revolution. The imperialist circles are trying to shift the whole burden of the crisis onto the shoulder of the working people, and that is why they need fascism. They are trying to solve the problem of markets by enslaving the weak nations, by intensifying colonial oppression, and repartitioning the world anew by means of war, and that is why they need fascism. But it is not just the sign of an aggressive version of imperialism, but it is also a sign of the weakness both of the proletariat, that is to say, for all the fear of revolution, for all the fear of losing power that drives the bourgeoisie and its retainers, the proletariat actually is not in a position to take power. There is no actual danger of a communist revolution in Germany in 1933. Dimitrov ascribes this to the weakness to the class collaboration by social democratic policy, which is to say that part of the labor movement that considered it a virtue to work within a capitalist liberal democracy toward the ultimate goal of revolution, as opposed to actually making one. But the weakness of the bourgeoisie, of the ruling class, of the economic ruling class, is also reflected in their outsized fear of revolution. What they believe the masses will do once they take power, the fear that they have that they will take power, all of that drives them to ditch democracy and parliamentarism before anybody who might pose a threat to them can gain a toehold. For 1933, Dimitrov is absolutely on the money. And one thing here that I think we can establish is that many, if not most, liberal accounts of fascism, the ones that I would take most seriously, and the ones that are today the most, like to the extent that liberals pay attention to it, you have people like the historian Thomas Zimmer in Washington, Ruth Ben-Ghiat in New York, and at Yale, you have Jason Stanley. These are people who are critics, who are good at describing fascism and clear at identifying the Republican Party as a fascist one. But they also are telling this story without a single mention of capital and capitalism, of class interest and so forth. They assume as a given that liberal democracy is capitalist, that capitalism is liberal democratic. And therefore, the best that they can offer, and what they have been doing when it comes to practical things, what do you do now that you've realized you're dealing with fascism, is to say, vote blue no matter who, and why don't we nuke Moscow already and support Ukraine with more weapons? So the struggle against fascism for them is fought on the battlefields of Ukraine as a kind of substitute war. In 1930, but anyway, so the reason, one of the main reasons why these people are ultimately engaging in this liberal ritual of learned helplessness, in spite of all their insight, is that they do not want to take that step to say, actually, it is about capitalism. Or, from a scholarly perspective, to actually take the step to say there is such a thing as capitalism. This is something that we need to take into account when we tell the story of what happened in history and what's happening now. It is not just something that fades into the, into the woodwork, into the grain of the woodwork, of the pattern of the wallpaper or whatever. It is a constitutive element. It is not just something that's there as a background buzz or what have you. So you have to actually look at it head on. If you don't think that capitalism can be theorized in any way, if you think that it's just the natural way of having a market economy that runs its course, you're not going to go there. So Dimitrov, of course, as a communist, goes there. In 1935, absolutely what drove politics, no matter where you look, is the fact that the capitalist world economy came crashing down in 1929. And that when you look at these countries that experienced hunger, mass unemployment, homelessness, just widespread despair and sickness, if you just, you don't have to go that far. You can ask people, grand or great-grandparents in the Central Valley, how they got here and, by what means they survived this Great Depression. Because people across the world, up until 1933, at least, when Roosevelt won the election in this country and started the New Deal, were left to their own devices. The demand of the chambers of commerce around the world, of organized bourgeois political pressure, was to say, leave the market to its own devices. It will upright itself again. Yes, there will be people who have fallen off the wagon and who will be crushed by it, but that's a small price we're willing to pay. Nothing could be worse. Certainly, the misery, the hunger, and deaths of millions of working people could never be worse than to inconvenience capital with state intervention, with government intervention. So if you want to regulate, if you want to collect more taxes to support the working people, who is going to pay for that? It is going to cost precious money, more precious than anything, more precious certainly than the millions of lives of these people who we don't know and wish would go away soon. So this is reflected in policy decisions by parties that are committed in theory and practice to maintain democracy. In Germany, the governing coalition in 1930, it contains the Social Democrats, who are the dominant political force of the Weimar Republic, and democratic liberal parties that are largely reflective of the interests and views of a middle class, sort of white-collar professionals, but mostly the leaders of industry, capital proper. One of the things that is a question when the economy comes crashing down is, what do you do with the unemployed? What do you do with the hungry? Whose problem are they? In the German system, there is already in place unemployment insurance, health insurance, retirement plans, and so forth. But like Social Security here, they're based on a revolving system where the current payments of the present generation pay for the past generation, where the presently employed pay for the presently unemployed, where the healthy pay for the sick, and so forth. So all on the assumption that you'll be there one day, and then you'll have your entitlement. The moment that the pool of people who can pay into this system shrinks beyond recognition, and their wages are slashed because competition means that you can now tell people you either leave or you work for the lower price, what's it going to be? The sum on the basis of which the contribution to these systems is calculated keeps shrinking. And what you can pay out, now that you have millions more people who will draw on the system, diminishes. So you have to fix that somehow. In the German system, the contribution to these funds is in parity. Half is paid by employers, half is paid by the employees. And I think that's more or less the same principle here with Social Security. There's always negotiations between these coalition partners within this democratic Weimar government about quarter percentage points. How are we going to move this? Are we moving away from parity? Of course we are. We're increasing the burden on the working class to pay for this stuff, but by how much? So the last democratic government in Germany falls over an unbridgeable disagreement over a quarter percentage point. And then there is no longer, until 1933, a parliamentary majority. How is that void filled? With governments that are appointed by the president of the republic, Hindenburg in this case, who then govern through emergency decrees that the president can also issue. And what these governments do with increasingly conservative leaders to the exclusion of any and all social democrats is, in so many words, austerity politics. Shrink the government to save money. Shrink the social welfare payments to save money. Do not, whatever you do, burden the bourgeoisie, burden capital, the owners of the means of production, with any additional cost to them. And of course, it's not like they couldn't bear it. It is not like they are the ones lining up for bread or soup. In fact, one of the features of a capitalist crisis is, if you paid attention in 2008, that there is too much capital to go around to invest profitably. You have people who are sitting on their money because they're afraid that if they do invest it, they will lose it. And they're not wrong, because the supply, the demand side rather, has so utterly collapsed that you would be crazy to try and produce some new product and bring it to market. There is already not enough effective demand to buy what is being produced. So you dial back production. You want to keep the factories more or less intact, because otherwise you have to write them off entirely. But as far as liquidity goes, well, that's a different question. But as far as actual capital goes, people have that. Liquidity may well be limited because even like in 2008, even the overnight lending between financial institutions, which is normally facilitated by people who have money that they don't really want to invest anywhere currently, came to a grinding halt, which is like an engine running out of motor oil while going 200 miles per hour, up a hill. And then, the nearest gas station or mechanic shop is like 20 miles away. So the burden of the economic crisis sure was shifted onto the working class in all these countries. The only place that bucked that trend was the United States under Roosevelt, of course. The Soviet Union, other major country at the time, did not have this problem. They did not have a crisis because they had communism. And where in the West, the economic development was a shrinkage of the market rather than, your usual growth numbers, the Soviet Union saw 10, 20, or 30% annual growth throughout the 1930s. So whatever issues they might have had, this wasn't one of them. Intensified colonial oppression. Wherever in the 1930s you had a possibility to externalize the social pressure and the costs onto your colonies, European empires, like especially France and Britain, did that. The Japanese too did that. One of the ways that the Japanese dealt with the crisis was, and this was driven by very much the same ideologies as in Italy or Germany, was by expansion into China, by chopping up China, taking the northeastern province of Heilongjiang, making it into a client state, Manchuria, where you have rich deposits of coal, iron, and other minerals, which of course for Japan, which has none of that, is a decisively important strategic asset. So China in general with a quarter of the world's population is always a good fallback if you're running out of options within your failing social system. You can always go in there and try and, exploit or steal or in other ways make use of this country, especially when it is not in any way unified. So you might have seen, and this was not the case, it was more or less run by competing warlord factions at the time. Still, there were like the strongest army at the time turned out to be the nationalist Kuomintang, the one associated with the nationalist Kuomintang party, who themselves were not that hostile to fascism and its ideas, actually, but they happened to be in the crosshairs of Japanese imperialism, so they didn't get to play as much on that front. But when you look at one of the election posters from by the Nazis in the 1930s, one of the things you saw there you might have noticed the communist caricature who is being pushed aside by the red-pilled nationalist worker who is saying, no more commies for me, I'm with the National Socialists through and through. The figures there look like, Victorian middle class, Jewish and Asian. The communist is the Asian caricature. And he has a leaflet in his hand that says China for the Chinese. So the idea that the communists are in solidarity with the Chinese people, who are the ultimate picture of racial inferiority to the European mind, on par with or even below Africa, and that the communists actually think they're equal, should be self-governing, should be in charge of their own country, would have been a joke to the nationalist and racist observer. So we might think, what's wrong with the Chinese governing themselves? Well, if you look at it through the nationalist lens, you will see that this is the ultimate joke, It's like John Adams writing to his wife, you want the right to vote for women? Who's next? Children, Negroes, Jews, Catholics? So in other words, it's a slippery slope argument. If this group of people who we recognized and treated as inferior is suddenly given equal status to us, where will that lead? So intensified colonial oppression and its justification is part of the deal of fascism. Now, the weakness of the proletariat, the weakness of the bourgeoisie. Certainly in Germany, if you look at the working class, the unionization rate, the militancy and so forth, all of that allows for things like the 1919 Spartacus uprising, which was an attempt to establish a socialist Soviet Republic of Germany, the 1923 resistance against the Kapp Putsch, against the 1920 against the Kapp Putsch, 1923 against the Beer Hall Putsch. On multiple occasions, there was an attempted communist uprising that was called off at the last minute, except in Hamburg, the messenger crashed his motorbike, so they never got the message, and the communists in Hamburg staged an uprising which was horribly beaten down because they were isolated. So that was a sign of, on the one hand, the relative strength of the German working class, but also the weakness that had to do with it being split. And the split is one chiefly because social democrats and communists. How are they split? Because in the 1918 collapse of the German Empire, the social democrats basically were left holding all the levers of power. They were the main opposition party. They had supported the war. Their support for the war had led the party to split. Two of its members in parliament left the party and then went on to become the founders of the German Communist Party. So as throughout the world, the question of are you a socialist / social democrat, or are you a communist, was defined by how do you feel about your country going to war in World War I? Do you think this is a worthy cause? Are you going out of your way to support it? Social democrats answered these questions in the affirmative. Communists did not. Now, in the United States, where Eugene Debs actually went to jail as leader of the Socialist Party for his opposition to war, it's an exception to the rule. So was the Netherlands. But in the Netherlands and the United States, social democrats discovered that they were still principled in their opposition to war only at a time when the war had already started and their own country hadn't joined in. So the Netherlands never joined, and the United States didn't join until 1917. And now, to his credit, Debs and the Socialist Party stuck with it. In the German case, however, the Social Democrats went so far in their support for the war effort that by the end of the war, the Kaiser was said to have told them, you've really turned into great German patriots. And if all that is now missing is if you could drop that ugly name of your party, and they might even join you. So they were really down to the point where they had become defenders of German monarchy, imperialism, and so forth. So when in 1918, the front collapsed and the German Empire clearly had lost the war, and the soldiers and sailors of the Navy rebelled because they were absolutely not willing to be sent out again on suicide missions in a war that they knew they were going to lose, and that they were already seeing that they were being treated like dirt, not being fed full rations, being given foul meat. That is like, whether it's with the Russian Revolution, whether it's with the German Revolution, the many times that crews of warships rose up and said, we're going to turn our guns onto our oppressors now, because they had been offered, like for their daily meal, meat that was either inedible because it was already so foul, crawling with maggots or something like that. So it really comes down to bread and butter issues at this point. Are you going to be treated like that and then die for the people who treat you like that, knowing it's a completely losing proposition? And for many people, the answer was no. And so in the two main German Navy ports of Wilhelmshaven and Kiel is where the revolution started. And you had Marines turning their machine guns on their officers, on the representatives of the state, whole brigades of Army and Navy going over to the revolution. Simultaneously in the big factories, workers' councils formed that took over and eventually quickly merged with elected representatives of the armed forces to form workers' and soldiers' councils that constituted themselves as a government of Germany. But as this was happening, Philipp Scheidemann, the leader of the Social Democrats, beat Karl Liebknecht, the leader of the communists, to the punch by an hour or two in Berlin to declare a German Democratic Republic. And then Liebknecht later on climbed up on a different balcony and proclaimed a German socialist Soviet Republic. So at that point, you had two competing state projects born out of the collapse of the empire that fought it out with weapons. A good chunk of Army and Navy had gone over to the revolution. In this situation, the social democratic leadership of the state, who had basically been handed the keys by the empire and been told, in the words of the last king of Saxony, when he was visited by a delegation from parliament that told him, you're out of a job, he said, well, then do run your own damn government. So that was the idea of how Germany became a republic. Macht doch euren Scheiß alleine, if you speak Saxon. So in order to defend their democratic republic with a constitution and a free market that had no support much among the working class, the Social Democrats turned to what else there was in society in terms of armed groups. the remnants of the Reichswehr, of the imperial army that had been decommissioned, but were still doing fine, living off the land, plundering, raping, either of the African or Eastern European war theaters, some of the worst murdering soldatesca coming back home, being told there are communists to be taken care of that are little better than the Africans and the Ukrainians and Russians you've been dealing with throughout the war. Go take care of them. And take care of them they did. So two leaders of the Communist Party, including Karl Liebknecht, who was one of the two to vote against the war, and Rosa Luxemburg, were murdered in cold blood and dumped into a canal in Berlin. Workers were mowed down with machine guns and tanks in the streets of Berlin, Munich, in various Rhineland cities, in Bremen. Still to this day, every January, the date of the defeat of this uprising is commemorated by thousands of people who marched to the graves of Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in Berlin. Everywhere, this is usually something that the communists do. In my hometown, however, for reasons of local specific conditions, it is a joint rally between social democrats and communists. So the weakness of the proletariat is this bitter split between the pro-democracy bloodhounds of the social democracy and the minister in charge of the army who ordered, who joined forces with these reactionary murderers, was a social democrat, a right-wing social democrat named Gustav Noske, who went on to hold many powerful positions in the Prussian state during the Weimar Republic. And he headed in for the communists. So Prussian social democracy in particular was eager to close down communist rallies, to have their police shoot and kill communist workers on the streets and so forth. So they were almost single-mindedly animated by anti-communism. They considered that party to be the main threat to their political project. And they were not willing to confront the rising threat of the fascists. The bourgeoisie, you might say, was also somewhat weakened because the catastrophe that the country had come into after World War I was clearly visible to most of the population as a consequence of the aggressive, adventuring imperialism of German capital. They were out there saying, let's conquer for ourselves a place under the sun, a position equal or rivaling that of the British Empire and definitely of the French. So the All-German Association I've mentioned before and other nationalist clubs that were closely tied to the leaders of German industry, finance, and agriculture were the ones who cheered on and considered it to be in their interest for the German Empire to go to war in 1914 and expand at the expense of other people. So with these conflicts, with these real conflicts in society, liberal democracy was not going to cut it. And when it comes to, because if the conflicts are such in your society that every couple of years you have open armed warfare, clearly whatever mediating, modifying, and compromise making power liberal democracy has is not going to cut it. So it really will eventually look like we're either going to have to diminish the power of capital, or we're going to have to take away people's ability to protest against it. So what is worse, in the words of James Madison, the cure or the disease? Should you want to combat dissent and conflict in a society by removing the ability to express it? Should you fight fire by cutting off oxygen, by abolishing oxygen? That seems to be, from if you're a democratically minded person or even just Republican minded, it seems a bad idea. It's shooting yourself in your own foot. But what's the basis for that? Who is really going to defend democracy if democracy means that the wrong kind of people might gain a hearing, might gain a voice, might even eventually gain power? Clearly, at that point, these formal considerations of free speech, freedom of assembly, civil liberties, and so forth are not going to be enough. You want to make sure that the dissenters who call into question your power as a ruling class do not get anywhere near the levers of political authority. So in the 1930s, for the people in charge of the economy, for the economic ruling class, it was a clear-cut question. No, we do not want democracy. The only open question was, in 1930, for German capital, do we want a clerical, authoritarian government by means of emergency powers, like we have now, more or less? Or do we want open fascism the way Mussolini is doing it in Italy? And very quickly, the decision was, let's go with open fascism. So the funding for the Nazi Party, the publicistic support in the press, in the corporate-owned press, for fascism, its arguments, its ideas, and so forth, the normalization of fascism was a function of support by capital. The United States and Britain, we had a speaker here on campus who wrote this book, The Newspaper Axis. I believe I mentioned it before, found that all the big newspapers owned by major publishers in Britain and the United States were in fact pro-fascist. Consistently throughout, well into World War II, hammering away at FDR, at Roosevelt, and saying he's anti-American, he's an autocrat, he's a would-be dictator, the taxes he raises, the war powers he invokes, this is not the thing to do, this is against our freedoms. Lurking just behind this presumably anti-war politics is, of course, on the one hand, the wish to see the other guys win. So the America First Committee is definitely in favor of Hitler winning the war. The other thing is that the narrative so common in the West, that it was the Jews who, through their machinations, caused World War I and profiteered from the war on all sides, is also extremely popular among right-wing and upper-class Americans. And to say upper class, to say bourgeoisie, and so forth, is at this time to say WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, with an Ivy League education, and usually solidly ingrained notions of white supremacy, especially when it comes to Jews and Black people. So this is a natural constituency for fascism. How do things look in 2023? And maybe we can consider this separately at one point. But as I took stock in as early as 2012 and looked at how people discussed politics, economics, culture, and so forth, I perceived strong parallels to the 1930s. The defining economic event for our time is still the 2008 economic crisis, and the shape of the economy, the way that capitalism is specifically organized, is still the way it was put in place after that crisis. The question was, do we re-regulate the markets to make sure that something like this doesn't happen again? And there was a clear answer to that, and that was no. There were attempts to do it, and it failed. There were other attempts to soften the blow of economic hardship on the working class by instituting the Affordable Care Act. And that was a dolt, as they say, that made led to a mere blip on the screen of the rising cost of healthcare for the working class, and did almost nothing to make sure that people actually get healthcare. Like, never mind the fact that you may be formally covered or whatnot. The ability to actually walk into a doctor's office or clinic and get fixed if you're sick has not improved at all, regardless of whether people have insurance. Or the fact that you can be put in medical debt and bankruptcy if you do seek treatment, and if somebody will consider you worthy for it, is still a thing that is a uniquely American feature. The people who are wiped out, sent from, their suburban home that they own debt-free to living out of the trunk of their car, or in some cases, the trunk of somebody else's car. So all these things, the shifting burden, the increasing burden on the working class, the intensified colonial oppression, swiping away protections of markets in non-Western industrialized countries has already been going on since 1989. Consider, for instance, the free trade agreements that were instituted under Clinton, and in Europe, Tony Blair, and still Kohl, and then Schröder in Germany. These free trade agreements that made it illegal for countries like Mexico, Brazil, Turkey, that were considered emerging economies, to protect their markets from the devastating cheap competition of the United States and EU countries, which led to the free fall of the economies in those places. In the case of Mexico, this is there's a direct link between this wholesale economic collapse of the Mexican economy after these protections against the world market were removed in the 1990s, and the rise of the cartels as the main conduits for international economic integration. In Brazil, one of the things that was the consequence of this was the rise of a fascist movement in its own right. In Turkey, modernization in order to get on speed with the world market also led to a fascist government. The abandonment of the old secular Turkish Republic with a model where now a clerical fascist party has locked in their claim to power in a still formally and nominally democratic and parliamentary system, and where all the old secularist republican traditions that were established in Turkey after the end of the Ottoman Empire were removed, including symbolic acts like the reconversion of the Sultan, is it the Sultan Ahmed Mosque, the mosque formerly known as the church that went by the name of Hagia Sophia. It was reconverted from a museum to a mosque, as a sign of, reconnecting to the pre-revolutionary, pre-republican, and pre-democratic traditions of the Ottoman Empire. So, colonial oppression, whether directly or indirectly, through governments that have no choice but to implement policies against their own people so that they can catch up with the world market, which is run by the main imperialist powers, was a fact of life since 1989. Depending on where you look, these other factors may or may not apply. But in the United States, if you want to talk about a weak and weakened and split proletariat, that is certainly a factor. There is no socialism, as Werner Sombart said, in the United States. There is no strong union movement. There is no socialist or labor party. There are two middle-class parties, and that's it. The weakness of the bourgeoisie I don't know about that. I think that in the United States, if there ever was an economically ruling class firmly in power, this is probably it. I mean, they have to snap their fingers and Washington will jump. Whereas if the people want something specific, I talked about the Princeton study, didn't I? That empirically showed, like the political scientists who, did I talk about that? About the state of American democracy. They asked Congress people what their priorities were. They looked at the polls that showed what the priorities of the majority of the people were, and they looked at what donors who run these think tanks and whatnot want from politics. They correlated that statistically, and they came to the conclusion that there is between the priorities of the American people, what they want government to do, and the priorities of the elected representatives, regardless of party, is a clear correlation of zero, zip. There is no relation. Everything that government does is done because somebody in this donor class, in this think tank world, thinks it's a good idea. And nobody cares, and nobody wants to know what the people want. So democratic government is a formality in this country. If it means that the substance of the political decisions are driven by the will of the people, forget about it. So this is not a sign of weakness. This is a sign of being firmly in charge. Is parliamentary liberal democracy inadequate in the US for maintaining control? If it were me being the ruling class, I would be thinking it's fine, you know, they're doing just fine. But of course, you can't think that way. Most abusive authority figures want not just firm control, but absolute control plus some adulation. Is that too much to ask? So, example, the ruling class in the South, the slaveholder class, felt that they needed to break the country in two when Lincoln came to power, because they could not stand the thought of not being 100% in full control of all institutions at all times. It wasn't because Lincoln posed any threat to slavery, not at that time. Slavery only became threatened because of the militant defense of it that the South mounted by breaking the country up. So in this sense, if you read the right-wing press, if you read the corporate funded right-wing think tank pieces, the Black Lives Matter movement, the Occupy Wall Street movement, all of this stuff was a sign that liberal democracy had been taken too far. And that this was still possible was a sign that we needed clearer, stronger countermeasures. So when Senator Hawley, I think it was, wrote in the New York Times at the height of the Black Lives Matter movement that he wished for this movement to be suppressed with tanks and machine guns and declared a terrorist threat, and the New York Times printed that, that reflects that kind of thinking. That reflects thinking, you know, this is not something you can tolerate. If democracy and free speech allows for this type of movement to take shape, maybe we made a mistake in having democracy in the first place. So in many ways, Dimitrov's description of the coalition of forces at work still does hold true in 2023. But we'll continue this on Wednesday. Now, if on your way out, you want to leave your papers here, I would appreciate that. And then hopefully I can turn that around by Wednesday.